Hi guys, Assalamu alaikum. We are going to be discussing this question from May June 2024. So this is basically the second part. This is basically part two of our stream. We did part one, I think, a week ago or something. So this is part two, and we're going to be discussing May June 2024 question number 4A. The question says basically, just a second. The question says, with the help of a diagram, explain what is meant by the circular flow of income in an open economy and consider the extent to which it can explain economic growth in such an economy. Now, as we have already discussed before as well, that for an 8-mark question, you need to identify that what content will you be writing under AO1, AO2, and AO3, because that is exactly how you will get the scores. Cambridge examiners mark based on whether you have correctly identified the assessment objectives and you have prioritized your answer or structured your answer according to the correct assessment objective that it should be classified into, right? So the question says, what is meant by circular flow? So the AO1 would be you explaining what the circular flow is briefly, since only 3 marks are reserved for that. Circular flow, you would explain that. You will draw the diagram, right? That's what the question is basically asking you to do. Explain what is meant by circular flow in an open economy, and make sure that you're explaining circular flow in an open economy. However, as far as the diagram is concerned, you don't need to draw the full 4-sector diagram. That also includes the international economy. A simple diagram that is showing the flows of income and expenditure between households and firms would be granted full 1 mark. Okay, so you defining what a circular flow is, 1 mark for the diagram, and then another mark for you telling up that what is a circular flow in an open economy. So यहाँ पे diagram का आपको पूरा 4-sector वाला diagram बनाने की ज़रूरत नहीं है. Remember this thing that whenever you are drawing a diagram for circular flow, and you will draw the diagram for circular flow only when it is explicitly asked by the question. Otherwise, you don't need to. There is no need, no mark would be given for a diagram if you draw it when there is no mark, when the question is not asking you to do. So you draw the diagram. In the diagram, you are going to draw a simple diagram that is basically a 2-sector diagram that is showing the flow of expenditures and income. So a simple diagram would still be granted full marks, because whenever you are explaining through a diagram under AO1, so the diagram for circular flow doesn't need to be the very complicated diagram that is showing the government spending as well, the exports as well, the financial intermediaries, the role of banks as well. So a simple diagram will still be awarded 1 mark by the examiners. Okay? Now, this diagram that I'm talking about, a simple circular flow diagram would still be awarded full 1 mark. When you are drawing a circular flow diagram in AO1. So whenever you're drawing a circular flow diagram in AO1, whether the question is on open economy or closed economy, a simple diagram showing the flows of income and expenditure between households and firm would be credited 1 full mark. Okay? So the 1 mark for definition, the circular flow of income shows how, what does it show? What does the circular flow of income shows? It shows how income and expenditure continuously flow between different sectors in the economy. Now, usually students write that circular flow of income shows the flows of money. That is incorrect. You have to mention that it is explicitly, that it is showing the flow of income and expenditure, right? This is when you will get the mark for definition. And since it is open economy, so you will explain what does that mean. In an open economy, and by the way, the question is saying explain what is meant by circular flow in an open economy. So you have to, under AO1, explain how the circular flow would work under an open economy. So in an open economy, households will supply factors of production, which is land, labor, capital, to firms, and they will receive income in the form of wages, rent, interest, and profit. And this is a very simple flow between households and firms. Households then use this income to purchase goods and services from firms. Obviously, you know that households are basically going to provide factors of production to firms, and in return, firms will provide factor income to households, and then households will use this to purchase the goods and services from firms, and in return, they will pay the factor income that the households have received. They will use that money and pay back to the firms, and that would be counted as consumer spending, that is C. And firms in return, and we know that firms obviously will use that money to pay factor services back to households. So this is basically the expenditure flow. The flow of expenditure and income is basically households buying goods and services from firms, which is creating an expenditure. This is what you need to actually mention in the answer, that the households that are buying goods and services from firms, that is creating an expenditure flow. So you have to use the term that when households will buy goods and services from firms, that creates an expenditure flow, right? And then you telling that firms will use this revenue to pay back factor incomes back to households, so the money goes back to households. This is a income flow, right? So ideally in an exam, as far as AO1 is concerned, when you're drawing a diagram, the flow of income and expenditure between households and firms is well enough credited. And then you say that this is how it works. Firms provide, households basically supply factors of production, and then you say that firms will, and households they would receive, factor incomes, and households will use this income to purchase goods and services. That creates a sort of expenditure flow, and then firms would use that money to pay factor incomes back to households, so that creates an income flow. So the circular flow is telling us that it's how income and expenditure flows in an economy, circular in a circular motion, and that is responsible for generating GDP and national income. So in an open economy, but the good thing is that in an open economy, so what exactly is an open economy? The circular flow also includes the foreign sector, where exports and imports, they affect the flow of income, right? So if you want to mention that exports are injections, imports are withdrawals, you can, but even if you do not, that's okay, because the question is simply asking you, explain what is meant by circular flow in an open economy. So circular flow in an open economy is when you have the flows of, expenditure flows coming from by domestic residents on foreign purchase goods and services, and you have income flows by foreign residents on domestic goods and services. So you just say that in an open economy, the circular flow includes the foreign sector, where exports and imports, they would affect the flows of income. You could mention that exports are counted injections, while imports are counted as withdrawals and leakages. So that is all 3 out of 3 marks for AO1. That's what was required under AO1. 1 mark for diagram, 1 mark for defining the circular flow and how that works, and the other mark for you telling that how exports and imports would work in an open economy, because it's an open economy, so you have exports and imports as well, and that also impacts the flows of income and expenditure, because that is included in the flows of income and expenditure. You tell that. The second thing that you talk about is under AO2 is now see, the thing is that in assessment objective 2, when you're talking about assessment objective 2, the question was asking you that explain what is meant by, and then the question, so the evaluation of this question, the AO3 basically, if you look at the and consider part, that says, and consider the extent to which it can explain economic growth in such an economy. So consider the extent to which it can explain economic growth in such an economy is basically you talking about the extent to which it explains economic growth in such an economy is AO3, right? And uh, now the extent to which it shows economic growth in an economy is AO3, but what exactly would be AO2 for this question? Like, you need to figure out that, okay, fine, if they're asking us, consider the extent to which, you know, it can explain economic growth in such an economy. If this is AO3, then what exactly, you know, for this question would be AO2? This is what you need to figure out, right? So let's hide the AO3 here, because AO3 would be talking about the magnitude or the size of how, to what extent would economic growth be explained. So economic growth in an open economy basically would depend upon the withdrawals, the size of the injections and withdrawals in the circular flow. If injections are more than your withdrawals, there would be national income would rise, which will lead to economic growth. And in an open economy, we know that injections includes your exports as well, which are incomes earned from selling goods and services abroad. And you know, you also have investment spending, you also have government spending as an injection, and withdrawals, which are leakages from the flow, which reduces your real GDP and national income, and it depresses AD. Would include your imports, your savings, and taxes. So these are your, you know, withdrawals. So if injections are more than withdrawals, then you will have economic growth. This is a fact, that if injections are more than withdrawals, you will have economic growth in an open economy, right? So your AO2 would focus on how would this happen. So what you will say is that in an open economy, if our total injections would exceed our withdrawals, that is the sum of exports, government spending, and your investments, if these injections, they exceed the withdrawals, which is savings, taxes, and imports, right, then there would be economic growth. Now, you need to talk about the cause and effect relation in analysis. You need to talk about the process of how injections exceeding withdrawals would result in economic growth, because that is what analysis is. In analysis, you would be given marks based on cause and effect, you showing the mechanism or the process through which a rise in injections would cause economic growth. तो तुम लोगों को यहाँ पे ये बताना है कि इंजेक्शंस अगर ज़्यादा हैं इकोनॉमिक विड्रॉल से, तो इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ कैसे आती है. खाली ये नहीं कि इससे इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ आती है, बल्कि कैसे आती है इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ. तो ये जो कैसे आती है, हाउ डज दैट हैपन्स, द मैकेनिज्म और द प्रोसेस इज AO2. So क्या बोलेंगे आप? You will say that when exports increase relative to imports, so you have more exports relative to imports, there is a net injection, ठीक है, which will increase firms' revenues. Firms would earn more revenues, they would earn more incomes, and this would again lead to higher production, and higher production would force firms to hire more workers, so demand for labor will go up. And you know, higher households, I mean, this would also further result into more higher consumption as well, which will result in economic growth, because when workers would earn wages, they would consume it back in the economy as well. So your C would go up as well. So higher consumption expenditure, and again together this would result into economic growth and a rise in real GDP. But on the other hand, if withdrawals exceed injections, ठीक है, for example, maybe withdrawals are exceeding injections due to higher imports, or maybe let's say maybe withdrawals are increasing. अब देखें यहाँ पे question में they are saying, with the help of a diagram, explain what they are saying. Consider the extent to which the circular flow in an open economy explains economic growth. So यहाँ पर you could, when you are saying injections are more than withdrawals, you could say that why are injections more than withdrawals? You could say that maybe exports are going up. That's why injections are more than withdrawals. And since you're talking about an open economy. And in the second paragraph, you can say that maybe withdrawals are more than injections and withdrawals are going up. And this could be maybe because of a rise in your imports. So if imports are more, then withdrawals will go up. And as a result, what will that result into? It will result into incomes leaking out of the economy. Expenditure leaking out, instead of expenditure happening in the economy, the expenditure is happening on foreign produced goods and services, which is of no use to us. So money is actually leaked out of the economy. And this means this reduces the flow of incomes in the economy, because it reduces the revenue stream for firms in the economy. If more is spent on imports rather than being spent on domestic goods, so potential revenues for firms goes down in the domestic economy. It reduces the revenue streams and income streams for the economy, which leads to less labor being hired, because now less is being demanded and more foreign goods are being demanded. So ultimately, it leads to lower output production as well, which means that now there's less demand for labor. So firms would lay off workers. That would also result into reduced employment. So this reduces firms' revenue. This leads to lower output, and it leads to lower employment as well, and it leads to lower national income. That causes economic growth to slow or even reverse, right? So economic growth slows down. There's a depressing effect on economic growth, or it reverses. Reverses means that it actually reduces. The economic growth goes in negative. So if, let's say, this is a time series graph, and your economic, this is positive growth, this is GDP percentage, real GDP, percentage. This is real GDP measured in percentage terms. So if your graph is going something like this, and what will happen is that imports agar badhna shuru ho jati hain, so it will have a depressing impact on imports, and ultimately this is economic growth reducing. And then ultimately, it could reverse, as in things could just turn upside down, and real GDP just goes into negative. So there's a declining real GDP basically is falling here. When economic growth, the percentage of economic growth goes into negative, real GDP is declining. देखें ये आंसर वैसे तो this is an ideal size, but you can sort of cut down a bit from here. But this is a good enough. I don't consider this a very long answer. This is a decent. This is a short answer actually. Typed answer में आपको लग रहा है बड़ा, because you're looking at the whole page and then you're looking at the answer. But this won't really be a huge answer when you're going to be writing this. But ज़ाहिर सी बात है, when you'll be actually writing in the exam, मिसाल के तौर पे you could say in the exam that you are saying that this reduces firms' revenue, which leads to lower output and employment, hence causing economic growth to fall. अगर आप ये भी लिख देते हैं तब भी सही है. It means the same thing. So this would reduce a bit of words, right? So got it? So हाँ, प्लस माइनस की जगह है इसमें. I feel के प्लस की तो नहीं, but I feel के थोड़ी सी माइनस करने की जगह है. ऐसा नहीं है कि नहीं है. But still, this is not a very big answer. This is an answer that you can still attempt in the time. 15 minutes में attempt हो जाएगा. Got it? I hope this answers your question. तो assessment objective 2 में आपको बताना था कि economic growth कैसे आएगी in an open economy. तो आपने बताना था अगर injection ज़्यादा होंगी withdrawal से तो economic growth आएगी. But how? You had to explain the cause effect, the process, the mechanism, that what happens. That if injections exceed withdrawals, AD rises, demand for labor rises, output rises, firms produce more, that causes more output in the economy. And if withdrawals are more than injections, then that causes a lower demand for labor, unemployment goes up, economic growth reduces, slows down, and real GDP falls. Ultimately, it will start falling. And AD falls, right? You don't need to draw any AD-AS diagrams, you don't need to draw any demand-supply diagrams. इसमें ये May June 24 में क्वेश्चन आया था, एंड इसमें गलती जो हुई थी बच्चों की वो ये हुई थी कि वो इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ में डायग्राम्स बना के आ रहे थे, ADS के डायग्राम्स बना के. वो कह रहे थे कि एग्रीगेट डिमांड विल शिफ्ट टू द राइट एंड रियल GDP वुड इंक्रीज. ये नहीं करना था. इस पे एग्जामिनर्स ने पीनलाइज किया है बच्चों को. ओके, ये इट वाज एक्सप्लिसिटली रिटन that examiners had penalized the students who were drawing these unnecessary. This wasn't even supposed to be drawn. ADS diagrams were not supposed to be drawn. Just because you're seeing economic growth as a word there doesn't mean that you start drawing ADS diagrams, right? Got it? So this is what the analysis is. You talking about economic growth, how would economic growth happen? And then your evaluation would be you talking about to what extent would this happen. So your analysis is how economic growth happens. or you can, so I mean economic growth, you talking ke economic growth could increase as well, it could go down as well, both sides, right? It could increase if withdrawals are less than injections and vice versa. And then AO3 would involve to what extent is this possible, right? So the question was saying, consider the extent to which it can explain economic growth in such an economy. So what do you think would be the answer to this question, where you are explaining, consider the extent to which it can explain economic growth? What do you think is the evaluation for this question? To what extent does a circular flow of income tells us about economic growth? What do you think you will write here? To what extent does the circular flow of income explains economic growth? क्या होना चाहिए इसके अंदर? So basically you have to understand that economic growth is of two types, right? One is actual growth. Actual growth में your actually real GDP is going up, आपका real GDP ऊपर जा रहा होता है, and vice versa क्या मतलब? What do you mean vice versa in the answer? नहीं, vice versa नहीं लिख सकते आप ये नहीं कह सकते कि if withdrawals are greater, J is more than W, सो इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ बढ़ेगी एंड वाइस वर्सा। नहीं, वाइस वर्सा नहीं है, वो आपको बताना है, क्योंकि वो एनालिसिस का पार्ट है। एनालिसिस में जब भी आप इम्पैक्ट्स बताते हैं ना, बिकॉज एनालिसिस ऑफ द प्रोसेस मैकेनिज्म्स, तो वो उसके इम्पैक्ट्स में दोनों चीज़ें बतानी होती हैं आपको, इफ़ देयर इज अ पॉजिटिव एंड अ नेगेटिव इम्पैक्ट, और इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ कुड गो अप और डाउन बोथ, बिकॉज इफ सम गॉट इट, सो both the effects have to be considered. You can't write vice versa. Examiner will not give you, देखिए नेगेटिव मार्किंग नहीं होती है 8 मार्क का, ऐसा नहीं कि कट नहीं होंगे मार्क्स, बट पूरे मार्क्स नहीं मिलेंगे आपको जी। गॉट इट शहरियार? नाउ व्हाट विल यू राइट इन what will you write under the fact that, what will you explain under evaluation? जी, evaluation में आप क्या बताएंगे? what is actually happening under evaluation? Like what will you write? जी शहरियार, what will you write under evaluation? Sorry. जी, so explain to what extent would there be economic growth. इसमें what you need to talk about is that you need to say that circular flow of income is a good, it's actually a good model to explain economic growth, but it's a very good model to explain what's happening to actual real GDP or actual growth. It's not a, circular flow could miserably fail, in a lot of terms, especially when it comes to explaining. नहीं देखे ना, यही तो फंस गए ना आप। relative size of injections नहीं बताना, gamer. I don't know what your name is, but that's what your nickname, that's what your YouTube name is. तो आपने बताना है देखें, आप क्वेश्चन को समझें, इसलिए इंपॉर्टेंस ऑफ पास्ट पेपर्स करना बहुत ज़रूरी है। अगर आप ये रिलेटिव साइज ऑफ इंजेक्शंस की बात नहीं करनी है, कंसिडर द एक्सटेंट टू विच इट कैन एक्सप्लेन इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ, तो कंसिडर द एक्सटेंट टू विच इट कैन एक्सप्लेन इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ। सवाल को समझें, राइट? कंसिडर द एक्सटेंट टू विच इट कैन एक्सप्लेन इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ। मैंने आपको हिंट भी दी है कि दो तरह की ग्रोथ होती है, एक होती है एक्चुअल ग्रोथ, एक होती है पोटेंशियल ग्रोथ। ठीक है, तो बात सारी ये है कि यहाँ पे बात सारी ये है कि सर्कुलर फ्लो का जो मॉडल है, दैट फेल्स टू एक्सप्लेन पोटेंशियल ग्रोथ, इट डज एक्सप्लेन एक्चुअल ग्रोथ। यानी सर्कुलर फ्लो टेल्स अस वेदर इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ गोज अप और डाउन, but it only talks about actual growth. It doesn't talks about the potential growth, because potential growth in an economy, or potential real GDP, which is reflected by the LRAS, you have to understand this. Your potential real GDP, which is affected, which is actually your LRAS, or you can say YFE. So एग्जैक्टली अब आपने सही बात की ना, अब आपने सही बात करी कि अदर फैक्टर्स सच एज एडवांसमेंट इन टेक्नोलॉजी में अफेक्ट ग्रोथ विच सर्कुलर फ्लो डज नॉट टेल. Excellent. This is what you had to tell in the answer. See, the question is saying to what extent does circular flow talks, to what extent is economic growth explained by circular flow? So you say that circular flow fails to explain how potential GDP changes. See, when will the economy move from YFE1 to YFE2? When there would be a shift in LRAS, when there's an increase in technological advancement, number one, or maybe there's discovery of natural resources, right? Or maybe there's there's more capital investment, coming in, right? So this is going to shift your LRAS, potential GDP. But circular flow is not talking about this. Circular flow is talking about actual growth that happens when, your aggregate demand goes up from Y1 to Y2. It doesn't really talks about what happens to real GDP. It doesn't talk about potential GDP. It talks about actual real GDP when AD goes up. So this is the evaluation. इसके अलावा आप कुछ और लिख कर आएंगे, आपको मार्क्स नहीं मिलेंगे, इसके जीरो मिल जाएगा. अब देखें मैंने कैसे लिखा है. The extent to which circular flow explains economic growth depends upon the relative magnitude and persistence of injections compared to withdrawals, number one. Number two, sustained and persistent injections such as export growth and investment may be associated with continuous increases in real GDP and national income over time as they continue to exceed withdrawals. Number one, the more the injections, the bigger the injections, the bigger would be the higher the size of the higher the magnitude or the size of the injections exceeding withdrawals, the higher would be the economic growth, number one. And the higher the size of the withdrawals compared to injections, the lower would be the economic growth. ठीक है. Second, इस extent तक तो वो बताता है, यानी circular flow model does explains about actual real GDP. So it may be associated with a continued increase in GDP, and here we are talking about actual GDP, actual real GDP. So the size of the withdrawals being more than injections, the size of the injections being more than withdrawals is associated with a continuous increase in real GDP, and that is actually, as long as injections exceed withdrawals, that is actually actual real GDP that we're talking about. So yes, to this इस extent तक तो circular flow बात करता है economic growth की कि भाई injections अगर ज़्यादा हैं withdrawal से तो आपकी actual real GDP बढ़ेगी. अब जितनी ज़्यादा बड़ी injections होंगी उतनी ज़्यादा आपकी बढ़ेगी. ठीक है, तो ये तो एक बात आप लिखेंगे, लेकिन जो चीज़ नहीं बच्चे लिख कर आए थे इस अटैम्प्ट में वो ये थी, जो नहीं लिख कर आए थे वो ये लिख के नहीं आए थे. Moreover, the circular flow explains economic growth through increase in real GDP rather than through increase in potential GDP or productive capacity. So injections in circular flow therefore show economic growth in terms of higher real output, not an expansion of potential GDP. ठीक है? Hence, as a result, so this is what you had to write. Okay, hence, as a result, while the circular flow is useful in explaining short-run changes in national income, it is very much useful to explain short-run changes in national income or short-run impacts on real GDP, because these are short-run impacts. When you're moving from Y1 to Y2, this is a short-run impact on real GDP. It doesn't really explain the long-term economic growth in terms of increase in productive capacity or potential GDP, and hence is not sufficient on its own to explain sustained economic growth. So circular flow of income is not really sufficient to explain. इसको आप छोटा करके लिख सकते हैं, इसको भी थोड़ा सा आप reduce कर सकते हैं. For example, आप यहाँ तक लिखें कि if it depends upon the relative magnitude and persistence of injections compared to withdrawals, the higher the injections as compared to withdrawals, the more the real GDP, the more the actual real GDP. And then you say that yes, circular flow of income, while circular flow of income does explain actual growth, it fails to explain potential growth. It fails to factor into account, it fails to talk about all those factors that could potentially increase potential GDP or productive capacity. So it does explain short-term changes in national income and real GDP, but it does not explain long-term economic growth in terms of increasing productive capacity. It fails to explain sustained economic growth. That is a movement from YFE to YFE1 to YFE2 is basically a sustained economic growth. That is a rise in productive capacity, or you can say a rise in potential output basically. ठीक है? So ये हो गई आपका. So ये आंसर है आपका. Got it? So now we'll move on to another question, which is again a good question. And just a second. So, with the help of a diagram, explain how an increase in aggregate demand may affect the level of real output and price level in an economy, and consider whether such an increases may become a problem. जी, ये क्वेश्चन देख लें ज़रा, अच्छा क्वेश्चन है ये. Explain how increases in aggregate demand may affect the level of real GDP and price level, and consider whether such an G. So what do you think you will write under AO? What will become what is going to come under AO1, AO2, AO3? With the help of a diagram, explain how increases in AD may affect the level of real output and price level, and consider whether such an increase may become a problem. So my question is that what will be the assessment objective 1 for such a question? तो आप इसमें करोगे क्या? आप इसमें सबसे पहले तो AO1 में you will simply draw a diagram you will simply draw the ADAS diagram, and you will define what aggregate demand is. So you need to define what AD is, you need to draw the diagram, and then you need to say that when AD shifts to the right, the price level goes up, the real GDP goes up. That is AO1. And then the question says, so AO2 would be explaining the impact of AD going up on price level and real GDP. That's AO2. You explaining the mechanism through which when AD goes up, the price level goes up. And then AO3 would be this part, and consider whether such an increase may become a problem. So if you're saying that when the price goes up, whether this increase becomes a problem. So यहाँ पे इसमें जो प्रॉब्लम आई थी एग्जाम में बच्चों को, वो आई थी AO2 में, व्हेन दे फेल टू एड्रेस द फैक्ट दैट price level may not always go up, and it depends upon spare capacity. I mean, it's not necessary that price level goes up, right? Because the question is saying explain how increase in AD may affect output. So it's not necessary. So if you're saying output goes up, then it's also possible that output does not goes up. So when you're talking about the effect of something, the effect doesn't necessarily only have to be that output goes up because of a rise in AD. It's also possible that output doesn't really goes up. And you saying that when AD goes up, there's inflation and price level goes up, it's also possible that price level doesn't really goes up. So that cause effect chain would be part of analysis for this question as well. So AO1 talks about AD. You give the definition of AD. You say that it represents total spending in the economy. You say it's consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net export spending. That's what, AD is. C plus I plus G plus X minus M. You draw an ADAS diagram, and you say that, an increase in AD would shift the curve from AD1 to AD2, that is to the right, which will lead to a new equilibrium at point B. And your real GDP goes up from Y1 to Y2, and the price level rises from P1 to P2. This is what you talk about in this question. Okay? Got it? So this will give you 1 mark for this diagram, 1 mark for saying what happens to price level and real GDP, and 1 mark for explaining what AD is. Now, analysis for this question, which is this part, explain how increases in AD. See, explain how increase in AD affects the level of real output and price level. This is what AO analysis is. You explaining when AD goes up, what is the impact on output and what is the impact on price level. अब बहुत सारे जो स्टूडेंट्स हैं वो क्या करेंगे, वो कहेंगे आउटपुट बढ़ जाएगा, प्राइस लेवल ही बढ़ जाएगा, डिमांड पर इन्फ्लेशन आएगी, वो दिए तो बताएंगे वो. What they will not tell is, in analysis, what they will not tell under analysis is that output may have no change, or even if output is going up, it can go up to very, very small extent as well, like this. And even if price level is going up, it could go to a very, either price level may not increase, or even if it does, then it could have a very small increase. It's not necessary that price level always goes up. Affect तो दोनों हो सकते हैं ना. It could go up, it could not go up. तो ये analysis में आप बताएंगे. So in the analysis you say that an increase in AD, which, and by the way, why is AD going up? As in why is actually aggregate demand increasing? So aggregate demand could increase because of a rise in consumer spending, maybe or investment spending because of higher consumer and business confidence, or maybe it's because of an expansionary monetary policy. So an increase in AD may occur due to a rise in spending in the economy, which could be due to a rise in consumer or investment spending, which could happen because of a rise in expansionary monetary policy of lowering interest rates, which is pursued by the central bank. And the investment spending could also rise. This is actually an I and C, that is investment spending and consumer spending could also rise due to higher consumer and business confidence. So if consumer confidence and business confidence is going up, that could also cause a rise in AD. Or maybe AD is rising due to government spending. आप इसको छोटा करके ज़रूरी नहीं है government spending की भी बात लिखते हैं, net exports की लिखते हैं, मैंने लिखी है, लेकिन we were still good if had we not mentioned government spending on net export. We could just say that AD could rise because of a rise in spending. This could be because of a rise in consumer investment spending due to expansionary monetary policy of lowering the interest rates by the central bank. Or this could be because of a rise in consumer or business confidence in the economy, because maybe, we have a more, individuals or firms in the economy have high expectations from our institutions, and they rely on the central bank in terms of controlling inflation. They're happy about the fact that, central bank would figure something out for the economy. So they're optimistic about the future of the state of the economy, hence they're spending, and so investment is also going up. So AD, so then you say that this rise in AD, or maybe if let's say you are writing a net export spending बढ़ी है, net export spending could go up because the exchange rate weakens, your currency depreciates. A currency depreciation causes a rise in export spending, export revenues, and a fall in import expenditures. So net exports, that is XM, goes up and AD goes up. So the rise in AD, what happens that the rise in AD would trigger demand for inflationary pressures that move from P1 to P2. So your economy moves from P1 to P2, prices go up, it moves from P1 to P2. But you see, the thing is that this is not necessary, and real GDP may increase. So the price level can increase and the real GDP can increase. But this is not necessary that this is going to happen. The rise in AD triggers demand for inflationary pressure, moving the economy from P1 to P2. But this is not necessary if the economy is operating below full capacity, right? Let's say on the relatively elastic part of the AS curve. So let's say if you're operating on, this part of the AS curve, let's say on this part, or even on, this part as well, on the classical, on the intermediate range as well. So price level wouldn't really go up to that extent, and neither would output go up to that extent. In fact, if you're operating on this horizontal range, then there's no change in output and prices. So that's what I've written, that if the economy is operating below full capacity, the increase in AD mainly raises real output with only a small rise in price level. So let's say that, if let's say you're over here and AD goes up, so real GDP goes up, but prices don't really, prices, you see that prices aren't really going to go up. They're going to go up with a very, very, very small extent, but there's a rise in real GDP here, right? So, and why does this happen? The reason why this happens is because firms have a lot of spare, resources are idle in the economy. So firms could hire more labor, more capital, more land without driving up their cost. So hiring more workers isn't really costly for them. They're ready to work in like any amount. They're desperate for work because the economy is already in a recession, so they're desperately looking for work. And getting more workers on board or more machinery on board wouldn't really drive up firms' cost. And so there won't be any inflation in the economy, but yes, it would cause a rise in real GDP. But if the economy is close to full employment or it is at full employment, any rise in AD, further increases in AD cannot significantly raise real output because resources are fully utilized. So it's not going to raise real output. It's not going to raise output. Or even if it does, then by a very small amount. But unless and until you're totally on the classical range. In this range, real output wouldn't really go up. Because resources are fully utilized now. They're already fully occupied. So in this case, the main effect is a rise in the price level in the form of demand pull inflation. There's no effect on real GDP. There's no effect on real GDP. There's zero effect on real GDP. But the only effect that is on the price level. So you see what's going on here. You're actually showing the cause and effect, the mechanism, the process. That, okay, fine. Because you see, here you are saying that when AD goes up, your real GDP goes up, your price level goes up. But that's not the only effect. There could be a situation that a rise in AD causes a rise in prices, but no change in real output. Or there could be also a situation where a rise in AD causes a rise in real output without causing any rise in price level. Or maybe causing a small rise in price level. A small rise or no rise. Effect, you have to see. आपको एग्जाम में effect बताना है ना. Effect क्या आएगा AD बढ़ने का prices पे और real GDP पे. ये AO2 का part बनेगा. एक सवाल आया है कि I want to ask a question about microeconomics and consumer producer surplus. I want to know that change in consumer surplus would happen more when demand is elastic or inelastic. Consumer surplus changes more. Both consumer surplus increases and decreases more when PED is less than when it is inelastic. This is what the right reason is. That consumer surplus increases more or decreases more in absolute terms. If prices go up, consumer surplus falls. If prices goes down, consumer surplus rises. But the extent of the increase or decrease in consumer surplus depends upon PED. If PED is less than 1 inelastic, the change in consumer surplus, irrespective of the direction of that change, happens more in absolute terms when PED is inelastic. Hope this answers your question. ठीक है जी? So in this case, the main effect of a rise in this case, the main effect is a rise in the price level in the form of demand pull inflation, which means that अगर आपकी economy is on full, your resources are fully employed and you're operating somewhere in this region, then, and you can see that in this case, there's no change in real GDP. It's still at Y star or YFE, whatever you want to call it. But the only increase is an increase in prices. And that's what the question was also asking us. The question was saying, explain how an increase in AD affects the level of, it affects the level of output and prices. So you're going to say that, it's not necessary that prices and real GDP always goes up at the same time. Sometimes real output may go up while prices will not change, while sometimes prices may go up and no change in real GDP. This is still AO2. This is not evaluation or something. अब स्टूडेंट्स के जहन में एक कॉन्सेप्ट होता है, हम लोग इसको क्लासेस में करवाते हैं अपने, कि क्वेश्चन की नौइयत और नेचर, क्वेश्चन के नेचर के हिसाब से एक चीज़ एवेल्यूएशन बन सकती है, एक चीज़ एनालिसिस बन सकती है. लेकिन स्टूडेंट्स को लगता है कि स्पेयर कैपेसिटी को मेंशन करना या बिलो फुल एम्प्लॉयमेंट वाली बात को मेंशन करना एवेल्यूएशन होता है. ये गलत है. ठीक है, ये गलत है. अगर आप इस क्वेश्चन में सिर्फ और सिर्फ ये लिख कर आते कि एडी बढ़ने से प्राइसेस बढ़ जाएंगी और रियल जीडीपी बढ़ जाएगी, तो आपको एनालिसिस में पूरे मार्क्स नहीं मिलते. आपके मार्क्स 1 to 2 मार्क्स आपके कट जाते हैं, क्योंकि रिमेनिंग जो मार्क्स हैं एनालिसिस के वो इस बात को बताने, 2 मार्क्स कटते, बल्कि रिमेनिंग जो आपके मार्क्स हैं वो इस बात को बताने के हैं कि सिचुएशंस ऐसी भी होंगी जहाँ पे प्राइसेस बढ़ रही होंगी, रियल जीडीपी नहीं बढ़ रही होगी, और कुछ सिचुएशंस में रियल जीडीपी बढ़ रही होगी, प्राइसेस नहीं बढ़ रही होंगी. गॉट इट. अब इवैल्यूएशन क्या होगी? इवैल्यूएशन होगी, आपसे क्वेश्चन पूछ रहा है एंड कंसिडर वेदर सच एन इंक्रीज में बिकम अ प्रॉब्लम. And consider whether such an increase may become a problem. So you will say this, your explicit comment or your explicit judgment on whether such an increase can become a problem is evaluation. You speaking in that style where you are framing an opinion or you are framing a judgment without saying in my opinion, that's not how you write a conclusion, is evaluation. So you say that an increase in AD becomes, so you see, question आपसे कह रहा है and consider the question is saying and consider the extent and consider when such an increase may become a problem. So you say when would such an increase become a problem. So इसी पर ही बात करनी है, आपने बात भी इसी पर ही करनी है कि वो प्रॉब्लम कब बनेगा. This is evaluation. An increase in AD becomes problematic when the economy is near full capacity. बिल्कुल सही बात है. When the economy is near full capacity, the increase in AD becomes problematic. At this point, further increases lead mainly to inflation. देखिए, अब आप अपना जजमेंट दे रहे हैं, यहाँ पे आप मैकेनिज्म्स नहीं समझा रहे बैठ के, कॉज इफेक्ट रिलेशंस नहीं बता रहे, वो आपने एनालिसिस में बता दिए हैं. अब आप बता रहे हैं कि वो प्रॉब्लम किस एक्सटेंट तक है. सो यू आर सेइंग एट दिस पॉइंट फर्दर इंक्रीजेस लीड मेनली टू इन्फ्लेशन rather than growth in real output. Now this is a problem. Because why is this a problem? It's a problem because persistent increase in AD beyond full employment level of output will overheat the economy. And once the economy overheats, it will lead to high levels of demand for inflation. And the problem here is that high demand for inflation will cause a loss of international competitiveness. Your exports, that could have a negative impact on BOP. So this is a problem now. Because now the economy is overheating, it could cause a severe loss of international competitiveness, severely impacting your current account balances. But not always. It's not going to be a problem. A rise in AD beyond full capacity is a problem, but a rise in AD below full capacity is not a problem. However, if there's because if you have substantial spare capacity, increase in AD are beneficial. ये बताना है आपको कि वो प्रॉब्लम नहीं है, बेनिफिशियल है. ठीक है, इट्स बेनिफिशियल. It's not a problem, it's actually beneficial. Got it? Because it will raise output and it will raise employment as well with limited inflationary pressure. So if you have a lot of spare capacity in the economy, you're somewhere here, let's say you're somewhere here, so an increase in output is going to cause either no inflation, or let's say if you move from here till here, then there's a very limited inflationary pressure or very limited inflation, but the increase in real GDP or real आपके जो indicators हैं, see, real GDP is real output, actual production going up, more output is being made. So this is beneficial, it's not a problem. So you saying, oh, hello, hang on, if there's spare capacity, then increase in AD is actually not a problem, in fact it's beneficial. This engagement between you and the examiner, that you telling this is what it is evaluation. Hence, increase in aggregate demand are not inherently problematic. वो inherently problematic नहीं है कि ये बोलना कि भाई वो problematic है, inherently problematic नहीं है. उनके effect depend करते हैं on the degree of spare capacity in the economy. And sometimes a rise in AD can actually promote economic growth, खास तौर पे जब resources बहुत ही underutilized हो रहे हों. But a rise in AD will become inflationary once full capacity is reached. This was the answer. This is how you had to evaluate. This is what the evaluation had to be. ठीक है? So that's it. We are done. So I'll see you all. I hope there aren't any questions or something. नेगेटिव मार्किंग नहीं होती है. अच्छा जी ज़ैनब, नेगेटिव मार्किंग नहीं होती है लेवल्स के अंदर. आपको मार्क्स डिडक्ट नहीं होंगे आपके. अगर आपने कोई चीज़ गलत लिखी है तो आपको मार्क्स आपके डिडक्ट नहीं होंगे. लेट्स से अगर आपने कोई चीज़ गलत लिखी तो एग्जामिनर विल क्रॉस इट आउट, और ही विल राइट नॉट आंसर द क्वेश्चन, और ही विल राइट टीवी, और ही विल राइट कंफ्यूज्ड, लेट्स से, डिपेंडिंग अपॉन व्हाटएवर यू हैव रिटन. These are the mnemonics that examiners use in the answer. But let's say कि if the examiner decides that आपको 4 मिलने चाहिए out of 8, so ऐसा नहीं है कि just because आपने एक बात एंड में कोई गलत बात लिख दी तो एग्जामिनर बोले ओ अब मैं इसको 3 दे रहा हूँ. ऐसा नहीं होता. ठीक है? सो जो आपने सही लिखा है उसके आपको मार्क्स मिल जाएंगे. गलत लिखने के मार्क्स कट नहीं होंगे, लेकिन मिलेंगे भी नहीं. वाई यू नॉट मेक LRAS Keynesian डायग्राम? वाओ, वाई डू वी हैव टू मेक LRAS Keynesian डायग्राम? सबसे पहला सवाल तो मेरा ये है आपसे कि आपको किसने कहा है कि Keynesian का डायग्राम बना के आना है आपको? ये किसने, हु इज सेइंग कि आपको Keynesian डायग्राम बना के आना है इसके अंदर? सबसे बड़ा तो अहम सवाल ही हमारा यही है कि जब हम पेपर्स चेक करते हैं तो हम ये चेक करते हैं कि बच्चे ये जो डायग्राम्स बना के आ रहे होते हैं, ये दड़ Keynesian डायग्राम बनाए हुए हैं. 8 मार्क का क्वेश्चन है बच्चों, पॉइंट बेस्ड मार्किंग है. इसमें रिक्वायरमेंट नहीं होती LRAS Keynesian डायग्राम बनाने की पॉइंट बेस्ड मार्किंग में. तो जो बना के आ रहे होते हैं ना, वो अपना टाइम वेस्ट कर रहे होते हैं. Keynesian LRAS को बना के आने के कोई मार्क्स नहीं है. ना मार्क्स उसके मिलेंगे बनाने पर, ना डिडक्ट होंगे ना बनाने पर. तो फिर रैशनल स्टूडेंट क्या करेगा? वो टाइम वेस्ट करके नहीं आएगा अपना. आपको मार्क्स मिलेंगे इस बात को बताने पर कि स्पेयर कैपेसिटी अगर है तो इन्फ्लेशन प्रॉब्लम नहीं है, या अगर स्पेयर कैपेसिटी है तो एडी बढ़ने से इन्फ्लेशन नहीं आएगी. इस चीज को डायग्राम में बनाकर दिखाने के मार्क्स नहीं है जी. नहीं तो अच्छे से ये बात किसने दिमाग में डाली है कि ये चीज डायग्राम से अच्छे से हो जाती है? नहीं होता. एज एन एग्जामिनर आई एम सेइंग दिस, दैट डायग्राम बनाने से एनालिसिस कोई अच्छी नहीं हो जाती. पॉइंट बेस्ड मार्किंग के अंदर आपकी एनालिसिस विदाउट द डायग्राम उतनी ही अच्छी होगी. अच्छी एनालिसिस, व्हाट इज अच्छी एनालिसिस? देखें, ये बच्चों का ना मिसकंसेप्शन है. उनको ये लगता है कि हम जितने डायग्राम बना के आएंगे उतने हमें ज़्यादा मार्क्स मिलेंगे. प्लीज़, ऐसा कुछ भी नहीं है. हाँ, अगर ये 12 मार्कर होता तो आप ये डायग्राम बना सकते थे, 12 मार्कर बना सकते थे, लेकिन उसमें भी कोई एक्सप्लिसिट रिक्वायरमेंट नहीं है अनलेस एंड अनटिल उन्होंने आपसे डायग्राम मांगा है. देखिए, यहां पे इन्होंने आपसे डायग्राम मांगा. इस क्वेश्चन में उन्होंने आपसे डायग्राम मांगा है एडी का. एडी से किस तरीके से इंपैक्ट होगा, बस आपने एडी के डायग्राम के मार्क्स हैं. ये बना के नहीं आओगे तो मार्क्स कट जाएंगे. इफ यू डोंट ड्रॉ दिस, मार्क्स विल बी डिडक्टेड. बट इफ यू डोंट ड्रॉ द Keynesian डायग्राम, no marks will be deducted. In fact, full marks will be given if your analysis and evaluation is correct. So you focus on writing better. You focus on writing the correct analysis and the correct evaluation. You focus on what exactly do I have to write an analysis and what exactly do I have to write an evaluation, rather than you focusing on drawing a diagram which is totally irrelevant and unnecessary here. It is not going to improve the quality of your analysis, because you have to understand that you will be given मार्क्स मिलेंगे. ठीक है, उतने ही मार्क्स आपको मिलेंगे. The question, so I'm going to be ending this stream now. तो किसी का कोई क्वेश्चन है तो बता दे. Okay, so I'm going to be ending this stream now. ठीक है. देखिए हमारा जो ऑब्जेक्टिव होता है ना स्टूडेंट्स को ट्रेन करना कि भाई उनको कब ज़रूरी है डायग्राम बनाना और कब नहीं है, कब इररेलेवेंट है। अननेसेसरी प्रेशर डालना हमारा काम नहीं है। एंड सिंस आई एम टेलिंग यू कि इससे कोई एग्जामिनर इम्प्रेस नहीं हो जाएगा। जैनब पूछती है व्हेन इज द नेक्स्ट स्ट्रीम। जैनब यू फॉलो मी ऑन इंस्टाग्राम, माई इंस्टाग्राम आई हैंडल इज़ आदिल उस्मान ज़ुबैरी। यू फॉलो मी देयर, वहाँ पे हमारा अपडेट हो जाता है। क्या कहते हैं टाइम टेबल वीकली बेसिस पे होती है हमारी स्ट्रीम एएस की, और वहीं पे हम अपडेट करते हैं इसको, ठीक है। एंड डू शेयर दीज स्ट्रीम्स विद योर फ्रेंड्स, विद योर पीयर्स, विद योर कॉलीग्स, classmates, so that they know कि streams हो रही हैं, so that more people attend, it reaches to a wider audience and it benefits them as well, because ये streams आपको बहुत फ़ायदा करेंगी। इससे आप एग्ज़ाम पैटर्न सीखेंगे, आप इससे सीखेंगे किस तरह अटैम्प्ट करना होता है। it will save your grade, okay? So I hope that helps and I will see you all in the next stream. Until then, take care and have a good week. 5 ईयर के टॉपिकल्स इनफ हैं अगर तुम उसको सही से अटैम्प्ट कर रहे हो और समवन इज देयर टू चेक यू एंड गाइड यू एंड टेल यू वेर यू आर रॉन्ग एंड वेर यू आर नॉट राइट। सो इट्स नॉट अबाउट अटैम्प्टिंग दैम, इट्स अबाउट अटैम्प्टिंग दैम in the right way, knowing that where you're doing wrong and what you're doing right. So whoever your teacher is, make sure that he's checking your answers, ठीक है। देखो एवेल्यूएशन को इम्प्रूव करने के लिए तुम्हें पास्ट पेपर की टेक्निक सीखनी पड़ेगी, और पास्ट पेपर की टेक्निक ही असल चीज़ है। एवेल्यूएशन को इम्प्रूव करने के लिए तुम्हें समझना पड़ेगा कि एवेल्यूएशन है क्या, सही है। और तुम्हें यह समझना पड़ेगा कि एवेल्यूएशन किसे कहते हैं, और इस बात को भी समझना पड़ेगा कि हर क्वेश्चन के लिहाज से एवेल्यूएशन चेंज होती है। जब तुम एटलीस्ट 10-15 क्वेश्चंस कर लोगे तो मैं समझ आना शुरू हो जाएगा कि एवेल्यूएशन क्या होती है। ज़ुरान ममदानी की पॉलिसीज़ नहीं, रियल वर्ल्ड एप्लीकेशन के कोई मार्क्स नहीं होते, नहीं डालनी है, इससे कुछ नहीं होगा। ज़ुरान ममदानी की पॉलिसीज़ डालोगे, ख़ास तौर पे 8 मार्कर में तो बिल्कुल नहीं डालना। बिला वजह का अननेसेसरी है। 8 मार्कर्स शॉर्ट होते हैं बेटा, छोटे आंसर्स होते हैं। एप्लीकेशन का मार्क नहीं है ए लेवल्स में। एप्लीकेशन इज़ नॉट एन असेसमेंट ऑब्जेक्टिव एनी मोर। हुएवर इज़ टेलिंग यू कि रियल वर्ल्ड एग्जाम्पल्स डालोगे तो आंसर बड़ा कुछ नहीं होगा। हम एज एन एग्जामिनर बोल रहा हूँ, कैम्ब्रिज का ए लेवल इकोनॉमिक्स का, इन चीज़ों से हम इंप्रेस नहीं होते। इस पे कोई मार्क्स नहीं मिलेंगे आपको। आप ज़ुरान ममदानी की पॉलिसीज़ डाल के आप जो लिखना है ना आंसर में वो लिखें आप, ठीक है। बना सकते हैं लेकिन 8 मार्कर में अपना टाइम वेस्ट करोगे डायग्राम बना के। टाइम वेस्ट करना है तो बना लो डायग्राम, लेवल बेस्ड मार्किंग में बना लो डायग्राम। उससे तुम अपने इवैल्यूएशन और एनालिसिस की क्वालिटी को इंप्रूव कर सकते हो, लेकिन उसकी भी कोई एक्सप्लिसिट वो नहीं है। बहुत सारे स्टूडेंट्स को हम पूरे मार्क्स भी देते हैं, बहुत सारे स्टूडेंट्स को हम 12 में से 10 भी देते हैं और ये 11 भी देते हैं आउट ऑफ 12, जो डायग्राम नहीं बना के आते मगर उनकी इवैल्यूएशन एनालिसिस सॉलिड होती है। इट्स अबाउट मोर अबाउट योर राइट व्हाट यू आर सेइंग। डायग्राम्स को उतनी अहमियत दो जितनी की उनकी है। ओवर ग्रेटिफाई नहीं करो डायग्राम को कि बट डायग्राम बना के आएंगे तो हमें मार्क्स मिल जाएंगे सॉलिड, ऐसा नहीं होता। तो आप जब आप डायग्राम्स फॉलो करते रहेंगे, जब आप ये स्ट्रीम्स में रेगुलरली आते रहेंगे, तो आप देखें अभी बहुत सारी आप लोगों के दिमाग में ना बहुत सारी मिथ्स हैं, ठीक है, बहुत सारी कन्फ्यूजन्स हैं, और ये स्ट्रीम्स इसीलिए रखी जा रही हैं आप लोग के लिए। तो आप इनको रेगुलरली अटेंड करें और इनको शेयर करें, और हम इंस्टाग्राम पे मुझे फॉलो कर लें ताकि आपको पता चलता रहे कि कब कैसे होता रहेगा। फरिया ने एक अच्छा सवाल पूछा है, वो कहती हैं कैन वी मेंशन रशिया यूक्रेन क्राइसिस इफ़ देयर इज़ अ क्वेश्चन फॉर ऑयल इंपोर्ट्स देयर वी विल गेट मार्क्स। देखें, मैं ये सवाल फरिया का और ये जो सैयद सकलैन साहब का, सैयद सकलैन का और फरिया का मिलता जुलता सवाल है। देखें, ज़ुरान ममदानी की बात कर रहे हैं या आप उसकी बात कर रहे हैं, क्या कहते हैं, कौन है वो, रशिया यूक्रेन की बात कर रहे हैं, क्या कहते हैं, जब इसकी रशिया यूक्रेन की बात कर रहे हैं, तो इसके अंदर 8 मार्कर में रिक्वायरमेंट नहीं है इसकी ये एग्जांपल्स देने की। हाँ, अगर आप 12 मार्कर अटेम्प्ट कर रहे हैं लेट्स से आपसे क्वेश्चन, लेट्स से मैं आपको समझा देता हूँ, अब सुन लें। लेट्स से क्वेश्चन कह रहा है असेस टू व्हाट एक्सटेंट वुड करेंसी डेप्रिसिएशन बी हार्मफुल फॉर योर इकोनॉमी। Assess to what extent would a currency depreciation be harmful to your economy। तो आप ये बोलते हैं कि भाई अगर करेंसी डेप्रिशिएट होगी तो इंपोर्ट करना महंगा हो जाएगा, एंड देन यू कुड से दैट द डिमांड फॉर इंपोर्ट्स फॉर ऑयल इंपोर्टिंग नेशन इज inelastic, so that could result in higher import bills for countries like Pakistan। या let's suppose अगर आप ये कह रहे हैं कि if you're saying कि लेट्स से आप कॉस्ट पुश इन्फ्लेशन बता रहे हैं इन अ 12 मार्कर, एंड देन यू से, आई थिंक दिस इज द क्वेश्चन दैट फरीद वाज आस्किंग, दैट अगर आप 12 मार्कर में कॉस्ट पुश इन्फ्लेशन बता रहे हैं, सो अगर आप ये कहते हैं लेट्स से कि कॉस्ट पुश इन्फ्लेशन अकर्स ड्यू टू exogenous rise in unit cost, maybe due to a jump in world oil prices, so you could say that you could mention कि रशिया यूक्रेन क्राइसिस की वजह से ऑयल इंपोर्ट्स गॉट एक्सपेंसिव। लेकिन अगर आप ये मेंशन कर रहे हो ना, तो आप बहुत ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा एक लाइन से ज़्यादा नहीं, ये नहीं कि आप रशिया यूक्रेन की वॉर की वजह से कितना आपने लंबा लिखा कि आपने, बस स्ट्रीम एंड होने वाली है, स्ट्रीम एंड कर रहा हूँ उसमें, बस मैं क्वेरीज एड्रेस कर रहा हूँ बच्चों की, कि आपने इतना लंबा इसको लिख दिया कि इसके कोई अलग से मार्क्स नहीं है। थोड़ा सा देखें, आप इस बात को समझें, सुने, इधर मेरी बात पे फोकस करें। लेवल बेस्ड मार्किंग में आपकी जो 12 मार्कर्स होते हैं ना, वो लेवल बेस्ड मार्किंग होती है उसकी। उसमें क्या होता है कि हम एग्जामिनर्स जो होते हैं, हम उसकी क्वालिटेटिव जजमेंट करते हैं। तो क्योंकि वो एक ओवरऑल असेसमेंट या जजमेंट होती है, तो उसके अंदर 12 मार्कर के अंदर थोड़ी सी गुंजाइश होती है 1 to 2 मार्क्स की डिफर करने की बिटवीन पर्सन ए टू पर्सन बी, बट 2 मार्क्स का टॉलरेंस लेवल CIs में होता है। मुझे 2 मार्क्स का टॉलरेंस लेवल CIs में होता है, उससे फर्क नहीं पड़ता, 2 मार्क का टॉलरेंस लेवल CIs में होता है। अब yeah, can you guys hear me now? Sorry, my battery just died. Can you guys hear me? तो मैं ये आपसे कह रहा था, सॉरी माई बैटरी हैड जस्ट डाइड, आई एम रियली सॉरी अबाउट इट। मैं आपसे ये कह रहा था कि 2 मार्क का टॉलरेंस लेवल होता है, तो आप उधर लिख सकते हैं रशिया यूक्रेन की क्राइसिस, बट मैं आपको फिर वही फरीहा बोलूँगा कि देखें, इसकी कोई एक्सप्लिसिट नीड नहीं है। अगर आप देखें, आपका सबसे बिगेस्ट एनिमी होता है एग्ज़ाम में टाइम। एंड हमने बहुत सारे ऐसे स्टूडेंट्स देखे हैं जो एग्ज़ाम के बाद कहते हैं हमारा पेपर ही टाइम पे कंप्लीट नहीं हुआ। तो हमें बहुत ही कैलकुलेटेड लिखना है, और जिस चीज़ की ज़रूरत नहीं है तो हम उसको नहीं लिखेंगे। हम अपने स्टूडेंट्स को क्या सिखाते हैं कि आपको ये सब बातें लिखने की ज़रूरत नहीं है। मैंने 60 में से CIs में बच्चों को 50 भी दिए हैं विदाउट ये रियल लाइफ एग्जांपल्स के, क्योंकि हम अपने जो पास्ट पेपर्स की क्लासेस देते हैं अपने स्टूडेंट्स को, हम उसमें उनके स्क्रिप्ट जब दिखाते हैं तो बच्चे देखते हैं कि भाई 60 में से 50 मिले में, 45 मिले में, इसमें तो कोई नहीं दिया हुआ, इसमें तो कोई जो है वो नहीं किया हुआ इन्होंने, क्या नाम है, रियल लाइफ एग्जांपल्स नहीं दी हुई। तो हम बच्चों को ये सिखाते हैं कि देखें, डायग्राम्स उतने बनाएं जितनी ज़रूरत है, जहाँ नहीं है वहाँ नहीं बनाना है आपको। हम आपको प्रेशर में नहीं डालते, प्रेशर में हम बच्चों को डालते हैं एनालिसिस और इवैल्यूएशन स्ट्रॉन्ग करने के, ये समझने के कि इवैल्यूएशन क्या है, ये समझने के कि एनालिसिस किस तरह की जाती है, क्वेश्चन टू क्वेश्चन कैसे वेरी करती है। ठीक है, ये हम स्टूडेंट्स को सिखाते हैं, तो हम उनको अननेसेसरी ये चीज़ें नहीं कि रियल लाइफ के बारे में लिखे और ये लिखे और वो लिखे। फरी, आई होप आई हैव आंसर्ड योर क्वेश्चन। आई होप सकलैन आपका भी क्वेश्चन आंसर हो गया होगा, ठीक है। तो सही है, इफ़ देयर इज एनी अदर क्वेश्चन यू गाइस कैन आस्क मी। देखें सकलैन, आप जो है ना वो सारी वो बातें पूछ रहे हैं जो मैं हमेशा यही कहता हूँ कि देखें, मेरी पहले बात तो ये नंबर ऑफ़ पॉइंट्स इस पे मैटर नहीं करता कि कितना लिखना है, 1.5 पेज 2 पेज, इससे मैटर नहीं करता। हमने 1 पेज के आंसर में भी 8 on 8 दिए हैं, हमने 3 पेज के आंसर में भी 0 on 8 दिए हैं, हमने 4 पेज के आंसर में भी 3 on 8 दिए हैं। तो ये मैटर नहीं करता, मैं आपको फिर वही बता रहा हूँ, ठीक है। हाँ, जो लास्ट ईयर की लाइव स्ट्रीम्स हैं वो वैलिड हैं, जो लास्ट ईयर की लाइव स्ट्रीम्स हैं उनको आप देखें, लास्ट ईयर की लाइव स्ट्रीम्स आप देखें, और इस साल की जो लाइव स्ट्रीम्स हैं ना उनको ज़रूर देखिएगा, क्योंकि इस साल बहुत सारी चीज़ें नई आने वाली हैं आप लोगों के लिए, जो AS में बच्चे दे रहे हैं ना May June 26 में, उनके लिए। अफशीन पूछती हैं कंक्लूजन और एवेल्यूएशन का डिफरेंस क्या है। बेटा अफशीन, कंक्लूजन इज़ बेसिकली लास्ट पार्ट ऑफ एवेल्यूएशन। कंक्लूजन जो होता है वो लास्ट पार्ट ऑफ एवेल्यूएशन होता है, यानी जब आप एवेल्यूएट कर रहे, एवेल्यूएशन के अंदर आपने बेसिकली ये बताना होता है कि आप जो जजमेंट दे रहे हो वो किस पे डिपेंड करती है, और फिर जो आपका फाइनल जजमेंट होता है उसको हम कंक्लूजन बोलते हैं। बेहतर है उसको कंक्लूजन नहीं जजमेंट बोलें आप, तो यू कैन से जजमेंट या कंक्लूजन इज़ द लास्ट पार्ट व्हेन द इवैल्यूएशन एंड्स, ठीक है। चलें, गॉट इट। तो हमारी जो नेक्स्ट स्ट्रीम होगी वो हम नेक्स्ट वेडनेसडे करेंगे 9 o'clock पे, सही है, या हाँ नेक्स्ट वेडनेसडे करेंगे 9 बजे। आप लोग मुझे इंस्टाग्राम पे फॉलो कर लें ताकि आपको अपडेट्स मिलती रहे, एंड आई विल सी यू ऑल। अब हम AD है तो सर्कुलर फ्लो का क्वेश्चन नेक्स्ट क्लास में कोई और अच्छा सवाल इन्फ्लेशन का प्रॉब्ली लेकर आएंगे आप लोगों के लिए, सही है। चलें, थैंक यू एंड हैव अ गुड वीक, अल्लाह हाफिज़।